Learning goal today is to explain how anthropogenic activities are decreasing the overall quality of the biosphere. Anthropogenic meaning originating in humans, and the biosphere is the part of Earth where organisms live. We'll do that by taking some pollution Cornell notes. The same way we took the Cornell notes last time, we'll fill in the notes from the slides over here, and then in the left side margin you will write your 3 questions. Don't forget the summary as well at the end of the notes. Pollution is the addition of a substance to an environment by human activity. It's added to the environment faster than it's removed or rendered harmless in some other way. The buildup of pollutants in the environment tends to have negative effects on the things living in the environment. Pollutants can come in the form of matter, which are gases, liquids, or solids. They can be energy, such as sound, light, or heat, or they could be living organisms such as invasive species or biological agents. If you look in table 1.5.3 on page 49 in your textbook, you can see some of the major sources of pollution. If you look on there, you can see the type of pollutant, the major source, where it comes from, and what effect it has on the environment. One thing that we should make sure that we're able to do is come up with a good definition of pollution. You can break pollutants down into 2 main types. You've got primary pollutants, which are active right when they're released from their source. For example, carbon monoxide from the incomplete combustion of fossil fuels, for example, when you drive your car. When breathed in by humans, this can cause headaches or nausea and can even lead to death by suffocation. What it does is it binds to the hemoglobin in your red blood cells and it bumps off the oxygen molecules from that protein. Next, you've got your secondary pollutants, which are formed by primary pollutants undergoing some kind of physical or chemical change after they've been released into the environment. An example here is acid rain, which is when sulfuric acid forms after sulfur trioxide reacts with water in the atmosphere. At this point, we should make sure that we're able to distinguish between primary and secondary pollutants. You can also divide pollutants into point source and non-point source. Point source pollutants are the release of pollutants from a single, clearly identifiable site. For example, smoke that comes from a factory. These type of pollutants are usually easier to manage because it can be found easily. You can look up and see right there who's polluting. Then you've got your non-point source pollutants, which are pollutants released from a wider area with no one clear source. An example here is water runoff from a neighborhood. It could have nitrates or phosphates, which are spread from fertilizer. After it rains, the fertilizer can be washed for miles before it drains into a lake or a river. Non-point source pollutants can be difficult to deal with because they come from many sources, and it can be almost impossible to figure out where they came from. We should make sure that we're able to distinguish the difference between point source and non-point source pollutants. You can also break down pollutants into biodegradable and persistent organic pollutants, or POPs. Your biodegradable pollutants tend to break down quickly and easily, and they don't stay in the environment for that long. Examples can be domestic sewage or soap, or degradable plastic bags and silverware that are made from starch. Then you've got your POPs. These are resistant to breaking down and they can remain active in the environment for a very long time. POPs can cause some significant damage to the ecosystem. One main example that we're going to take a look at later is a pesticide called DDT. We should be able to distinguish between biodegradable and persistent organic pollutants. Pollutants can also be broken down into acute and chronic pollutants. Acute pollution is pollution that comes on strong and suddenly. It happens when large amounts of a pollutant are released all at once. An example is the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which happened in 1986. A nuclear reactor melted down and released large amounts of radiation into the atmosphere. Chronic pollution results from the long-term release of a pollutant, but in smaller amounts that are steadily released. This can actually be worse than acute pollution because it's more difficult to clean up. An example would be air pollution caused by smog. You should make sure that you can distinguish between acute and chronic pollution. There's a famous oil spill in 1989 called the Exxon Valdez disaster. This happened when an oil tanker traveling in the ocean ran aground. It released over 10 million gallons of crude oil off the coast of Alaska into the ocean. What I want you to do at the bottom of your paper there is describe the type of pollution that occurred here using all 4 types of pollution. So is that primary or secondary, point source or non-point source, biodegradable or POP, and acute or chronic. Pollution can be monitored closely to protect both human health and the environment's health. This can occur by using direct measurements or indirect measurements. Direct measurements are quantitative measurements used to record the amount of a pollutant in water, the air, or soil. Some examples here are testing water for pH, measuring gas ratios in the air, and air quality testing for ppm, which is parts per million. Rounding out our examples of direct measurements of pollution, we've got bacterial testing in the soil, where we can take a sample and determine the amount of organic matter or bacteria present. The concentrations of heavy metals in soil, such as zinc, lead, or copper. These tend to show up in industrial areas or through the application of fertilizers in agriculture. Also coming from fertilizers are nitrates and phosphates, which tend to end up in the water supply, and this can be directly measured as well. We should be able to list some of the ways that we can directly measure pollution in the environment. Next, we have indirect measurements, which measure pollution by measuring changes in the environment. One good way we can indirectly measure pollution is by looking at what we call the dissolved oxygen concentration of water. This can change due to other pollutants that are added to the water, and it can also change due to heat that's added to the water. Warmer water actually holds less oxygen. So the colder the water is, the more dissolved oxygen will be in that water. We can also look at indicator species, which we'll talk more about in topic 4, but basically these are species that are only found if the conditions have been polluted or are unpolluted. We can also look at overall biodiversity of a particular ecosystem. Biodiversity refers to the variety of life that can be found in a particular area. This can be difficult to measure, but in general, pollution can cause an environment to be less diverse, so you'll have less different types of organisms living there. We should be able to list a couple ways that we can measure pollution indirectly. You might be thinking to yourself, what are some ways that we can try to manage pollution? Well, there are some different strategies that can be utilized here, depending on the situation. We can really look at 3 main ways to manage pollution. The best way to manage pollution is to change the human activity that actually produces that pollutant. And the main way this can happen is simply by educating the public or giving people alternative strategies to meet their needs. We can also try to regulate or prevent the release of a pollutant into the environment. So this doesn't totally prevent the release of a pollutant, but it can slow it down, or we can try to manage it using legislation. So if the first 2 strategies don't work, we can always try to clean up and restore an environment that's been damaged by pollution. This usually happens by trying to remove a pollutant that's been released into an ecosystem. We should make sure that we can list the 3 main pollution management strategies that we just talked about. And there's a good figure that explains these management strategies on pages 52 and 53. It's figure 1.5.6. We're done with the notes today. Make sure you go back and write your questions in the margin and complete your summary there at the end of the notes.